can't think about Wayne State and being here for 150 years without really also thinking about Detroit, because the two have been so tied together for so long. And so this is such a fitting topic. I think the next symposium is also going to be on this topic. So no, we're not. It's not. But it's going to be something. It's going to be Lee Bollinger. It's going to be coming for free speech. But to cap this off, in the last two symposia was something that is so relevant to what's happening in higher education right now and to what's happening in Detroit right now. And to look in the past and reflect on it, reflect on both what's happening in Detroit, but also for Wayne State is really a great opportunity. So I want to thank the organizers of the symposium. You know, given the history of the Kerner Commission, it is so, I feel so, such gratitude that we're able to have with us, you know, someone who was part of that report. You know, the commission is famous for its brutally frank conclusion that, and I remember this phrase so vividly, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. So today offers a chance to really take a look at where we stand and how we can avoid such a fate in the future.
I'm honored to be here, of course, and I've been asked to speak about the origins and operations of the Kerner Commission, of which, as was said, I was a member, of course. Well, I'm glad to be here and to talk about the commission and about the issues of race and poverty and what can and should be done about them today, 50 years after the Kerner report. And I was, of course, a United States Senator, and 3 days earlier, when the Detroit riots here were at their worst, after getting my friend and seatmate Senator Walter Mondale to co-sponsor it, I introduced in the Senate a resolution to create a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission to look into the disorders, not just from a law and order standpoint, but also to get at fundamental causes and to come up with recommendations, quote, to make good the promise of America for all Americans immediately. I had the resolution referred to the subcommittee which I chaired, and I held hearings on it the very next morning. My witnesses being Daniel Patrick Moynihan, not then a senator, and Whitney Young, head of the Urban League. But then it dawned on me that we didn't have to wait for congressional action, that President Johnson could himself name the commission by executive order. I called Douglas Cater of the White House staff and urged such presidential action, following up the call, as Cater asked me to do, with a hand-delivered formal letter to the president. So back now to President Johnson's telephone call to me. He said, I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about. I said I was glad to hear it. He said, I'm going to put you on it. I said, I didn't expect that, but I'd do my best. He said, and all this is word for word, he said, now don't you be like some of your colleagues. I appoint them to things and they don't show up. I said I'd show up. And another thing, Fred, President Johnson said, I said, yes, sir, Mr. President. He said, I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man. I said, yes, sir, I am a Johnson man. The President said, if you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off. He did not say blank. And after calling on Cyrus Vance to give us an up-to-date report on the situation in Detroit, the President gave us our marching orders. He charged us, the Kerner Commission, to investigate the disorders and recommend action. Again, not only from a law and order standpoint, but also in regard to their deeper causes. Quote, let your search be free, the President told the Commission members. Find the truth and express it in your report. And that is exactly what the Commission famously did, which, as it turned out, not only shocked the conscience of the nation, but greatly upset President Johnson as well. Commission members broke into teams for site visits to the riot cities and personally observed there close up the human cost of wretched poverty and harsh racism. Mayor Lindsay and I went first to Cincinnati, for example, for a closed, no press meeting with a well-educated and successful group of young male and female black militants, a well-educated group, and a meeting that it had taken our staffs more than a week to set up. None of these young men and women wanted to be there. None would even shake hands with us. One young man expressed the view of all of those present when he said he couldn't stand to look at white people anymore. One way or another, all of them said they didn't trust white politicians like us to do anything about racism and poverty. And one young man said, and that includes those racists, Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. Mayor Lindsay and I and the other commission members came back from these site visits sobered and somewhat shaken. And then the commission then began 44 days of meetings from December 67 until nearly the end of February 1968 to actually write the Kerner report, every word of which was read aloud, then discussed and revised before being approved by a majority vote of commission members. On harder questions, decisions would sometimes turn on a vote of 6 to 5. In our report, we condemned violence and lawlessness in the strongest terms, saying that they, quote, nourish repression, not justice. Our basic and most famous finding, of course, just quoted, was our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The report stated further, quote, segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro, as we said then, can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. But misinformed about its contents and distracted by the Vietnam War, President Johnson rejected the Kerner report. And this is, I think, particularly sad because President Johnson did more against poverty and racism than any other president before or since. In any event, the report was leaked to the press with evil intent before the commission could, as planned, background reporters so that they would fully understand the reasons for the commission's findings and recommendations. This leak resulted in hastily written news stories which appeared throughout the country the next morning and which carried shocking headlines, something like, white racism cause of black riots, commission says. Many people never learned the rest of the story, as they say. Not surprisingly, there was considerable backlash in the country. And despite the opposition, America made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for almost a decade after the Kerner report. Progress was slowed or stopped and finally reversed. Some improvement occurred, of course, during each of the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations, but regression has been the trend since the mid-1970s, and that is sadly true today. There is still far too much excessive force by police, too often deadly force, especially against African Americans. White supremacists have become bolder and more violent. Housing and schools have been rapidly resegregating, locking too many African Americans and Latinos into slums and their children into inferior schools. Ever since the 1970s, the African American unemployment rate has continued to be about double that for whites. Latino unemployment continues high as well. Labor union membership has shrunk from about 25% of private jobs to about 6%. Inequality of income in our country has greatly worsened. Rich people are healthier and live longer. What's fair about that? They get a better education, too. And a better education produces greater inequality of income, and then that greater economic power translates into greater political power. So where do we go from here? We know what needs to be done, and we know what works. A more progressive tax system, making rich people and big corporations pay their fair share. Stopping tax and spending subsidies that redistribute wealth and income in the wrong direction. Strengthening unions and eliminating the legal and other barriers which impedes the right of workers to organize. Raising the minimum wage to a living wage, which would be a giant boost to the economy and bump up middle-class wages too. We need more affordable housing, and housing and schools integrated by income and race. We also need re-regulation of big banks and big finance. Better income for those who can't work and who can't find work. A sound, free public education for all, from early childhood through college. Education and training with special attention to those put out of work by circumstances beyond their control. Health care for all. The basic American principles of equal rights and equal opportunity for all, whatever a person's social standing, zip code, religion, gender, or color. Investment in infrastructure, in science, in alternative energy, and in technology. Investment in ourselves. But how can we get these things done when present times are so politically tough? First, I think we can take heart from the fact that the great civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, who I think is a living saint, and others, began in a terrible and depressing time of Jim Crow, rigid segregation, and harshest racism. The odds were overwhelmingly against them, but still they courageously resisted, persisted, and ultimately prevailed. We can take heart, too, from the fact that the polls show that the majority of Americans support the measures that we should now adopt and the steps that we must now take. We can take heart from the fact that we live in a time of unprecedented, growing, and powerful people's activism, with great new efforts and organizations like the Women's March, Indivisible, Black Lives Matter, and March for Our Lives. Finally, the Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, founder of the rapidly spreading Moral Mondays movement and a new Poor People's campaign, has, I think, pointed the way we should go. We can't keep fighting in our separate silos, he says. We must make our enemies fight all of us together. And he's shown with the Moral Mondays movement, which is spreading, and his new Poor People's campaign, that you can get people together across race and gender lines, across income lines, across all sorts of lines for the common good. And that if we do that, we can take our government over again and begin to move again in the direction that Americans must and want to go. I think that is important, and I think it's well backed, because as I like to repeat, everybody does better when everybody does better. Thank you.
I was asked to talk a little bit about Newark and its civil disobedience in 1967, as well as our own here in Detroit. And there is an interesting thing when you look at both situations. The only difference is when the African American population began to emerge in Newark from the Great Migration from the South, what you found was that by then the Irish, the Italians, and the other European immigrants had already started to assimilate in the greater society there. That it took some of them only one generation of unskilled immigrants to move into the middle class. Most had moved into the middle class by the second generation. But for the African Americans who migrated from the deep South north, found a whole different experience. Their racial isolation was semi-permanent. There was no anticipated access into the greater society. Their schools were segregated. Their hospitals were segregated. And the workplaces had two entrances for them. And so, and on to college. But at 17 years old, when the civil disobedience occurred, we were living on Grand River, and I can still feel, as I talk about it, the rumble of the tanks, the rattles of the windows in the house. I can still smell the diesel fuel. I can still hear the sounds of gunshots at night. I can still see and feel the urgency of fear from that experience. And very interesting, it wasn't as much the fear of the state police that had arrived, or the National Guardsmen that had arrived, or even President Johnson's 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne, who were all Vietnam hardened, proud soldiers. But it was the fear of the Big Four coming into your home. I heard the words of Dr. King, not only when he testified there with the Senators Commission, but when I read his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? And he talked about a social movement that would be nonviolent, similar to what he had learned from Gandhi, who had learned from Thoreau. And Gandhi practiced it in South Africa for 22 years, and then he went home in India and brought down the great British Empire and created an independent India as we have today. And I said, it's the Martin Luther King social change movement. And that's why I chose to go and work down in Atlanta with Mrs. King, and to learn from her and John Lewis and Andy Young and all of the men and women who made that movement the success that it is. So I subscribed it today, 50 years later, that the social change movement, the nonviolent social change movement, and all the recommendations that the Kerner Commission has laid out.
I'm working on a book on a famous Detroiter, General Gordon Baker. I see Professor Heron in the back, who I know. I've watched his videos talking to General years ago. But he used to tell a story that was reflective of a point that you were talking about in terms of jobs in the automobile industry in the 60s that were unlike most other places. We had the highest wages in the nation at that time, and among the highest rates of black home ownership in the entire country when Detroit rebelled. But General used to tell the story, he was preemptively arrested. You know people are looking out for you when you're preemptively arrested in a rebellion. He was, and I'm gonna say rebellion unapologetically, I should add, because on your flyer, I think it talks about language, and it mentions that rebellions are oftentimes organized or considered organized, but I've been in rebellion much of my life, and much of it was disorganized, so I'm gonna use that term. General, though, when he got arrested, was taken to Ionia State Prison, about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours away. And when he got there, he saw damn near the whole of the second shift from Dodge main plant, right? So this just gives you an idea about the character of the people that were rebelling. You know, one of the things the Kerner Commission reports is that, you know, on average, the people that were involved or arrested were more highly educated than the rest of the population, particularly the unemployed population. So that's of significant note. I think another point that's important to talk about in the context of what happened then and what the commission found regarding kind of the situation in Detroit today is they made note of the role of the media in terms of creating a false image about race relations. And Detroit was known as the model city, right? It was seen as a place where a rebellion couldn't happen because the employment rate was too good, wages were too good, black home ownership was too good, and we had a liberal, to the left of John Lindsay, who was integral in the war on poverty, who was the mayor, Jerry Kavanaugh. So figured that Detroit would be the last place, if any place was to have a rebellion, it would be the last place.
Words affect how we think. And I think that's really important, because one of the issues is, what do we describe 1967 as, whether Newark or Detroit? And just let's look at the words, and if you haven't been to the Detroit Historical Society Museum to look at the 67 exhibit, make sure you do so before the end of the year, because it was superb. It captures just a little bit of what you were talking about, Ron, on feeling, smelling, and hearing the riot. Now, look, word I just used, right? Riot. Okay. All right. Here's the terminology. We sometimes call it the uprising. Okay, that's a nice neutral word, so people get mad at you. What do you mean? You're not taking a stand. We can call it the riot. That blames the victims, because it seems to be an unpredictable crowd activity. Sometimes we even call it a race riot, which is wrong in terms of 67. 1943 was blacks against whites, but 67 wasn't. And this was neither organized nor unorganized. So what word do we use? Okay, uprising basically is dismissal very often. Civil disturbance, that's nice and neutral. In fact, I use it very often. But that's a word that people say, well, you're not taking a side. Civil disturbance. It was more. What about the police brutality? What about the looting? What about the other issues? Insurrection. That's a violent uprising against authority of government. That's what was used by the Michigan National Guard. That's probably what was used by the people who talked to President Johnson. I don't know that, but that's the word that's kind of almost basically early, because people thought the insurrection was part of a larger movement. Well, yes it was, and no it wasn't. The worst thing for me, though, even in that, was 68. Because when I came home, and everything changed, good things, community planners got hired, for example. We began talking to people in the community and making them part, not just paying professionals, but looking at that, was that all kinds of other things had changed. For example, the fear in the community in the fall of 68 was palpable. And you know what? I feel like that now. And the hostility was palpable. And you know what? I feel like that now. And the answer was in February, all of a sudden, I don't know what happened, but we couldn't stand it anymore. Those silos that we talked about. We started talking to each other. We started trying to figure out, what do we do to get back together? And then the Tigers won the pennant. Oddly enough. Sports brings black and white together. So what you had is attempts to make changes. You had the politics. You did have the Johnson activities. There was lots of money coming in, but people were continuing to move away. Police brutality and police control was continuing to stay, and we are still living with some of that. Why don't we give up? Because if you say we can't do anything, and if you don't vote, nothing will happen. You've lost before you start. So some of us are still there, but you know what? I gotta hand it out to all of you. I'm 81. It's time, as is happening, for the 18, the 21, the 30-year-olds to make those changes. And if we don't make those changes, voting and action in those committees, then we have lost and we'll be back where we was. We cannot live like that. We must not live like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet.
So the main research objective of this paper, of this research, is to understand what are the factors that was a barrier in the implementation of the Community Advisory Council system. So the Detroit Community Advisory Council system, the statutory objective of is to descriptively and substantively represent the need of the community. So it serves as a mediating structure by assisting groups, agencies, business, and residents in resolving community problems. They are supposed to annually meet with the city council and then the mayor to discuss challenges confronting the district, and then discuss resources that are required to advance community interest. So I'm going to go over some of these factors that I analyzed. The first is, in terms of the statutory factors, there has to be a design aspect of it where it facilitates the implementation. According to the literature suggests that for these type of community-based participatory mechanisms to be successful, you have to create a citywide system. So in the, from the outset, the residents from every part of the community must be participating in the system so that they have a stake in the system. However, in the case of Detroit, it created a three-step, really complicated process in initiating this in the implementation part. So first, they require this complicated petition process to establish the CAC. So specifically, in terms of, if you were in one of these districts and trying to create a CAC, the first process was that the city had to adopt an ordinance, city ordinance, that specified about the CACs in the first place. And then the next step was each community had to collect signatures for petitions in order to establish the CAC. And currently, most of the districts are stuck at this stage of collecting the signatures. And then once they have collected enough signatures for the petitions, then they have to either nominate themselves and collect signatures to get nominated to be elected as CAC members. According to my fieldwork, many people argue that these two-step process has been one of the biggest barrier in initiating the process in the first stage. So finally, for the non-statutory factors, these are basically reflecting the strong motivation coming from bottom up to top down so that we can make participation effective and to make participation work. So recommendation and conclusion. What I found in this research from fieldwork and documentary research is that for statutory factors, support from implementing agency is critical for the success of the new participation mechanisms. There has to be a formal specific decision rule in place that is supportive, and also resource funding and staff support is critical. And it seems to me the size of the community is too big for an effective representation to occur. So in terms of non-statutory factor, although I didn't mention in the presentation, many, I do mention it in the paper, and then also the interviewees mentioned that it was in the time when the Detroit was going through the fiscal crisis. This is between 2012, 13, 14, and it was overshadowed by the bankruptcy issue. And then also the impact of emergency management. It wasn't the key issue that Detroiters were focusing on. Finally, the mayor, as noted before, the mayoral and departmental city council and then the community leaders support leadership will affect the success and sustainability of the system. And thank you.
Rather, I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about what that means, that movement from a city council elected at large, completely at large, to a city council elected primarily by districts. To do that, you need to go back a few years, at least 100 years, to the Detroit City Charter of 1918, which at the time was a model of progressive reform. And so what I'm going to do is just discuss a little bit about what sort of the thinking is behind district representation at the local level. Now first, the term progressive has changed pretty dramatically in meaning ever since Ronald Reagan made the term liberal a swear word, so people have started to use the term progressive to mean liberal. Basically what the progressive era brought about was changing local government from what was called a machine politics setup to one that was more progressive and reformed. Some use the term reform as opposed to progressive. I like the term progressive because it's the historically correct one, I think. the progressive era, those who adopted what are called progressive city charters, really changed the nature of local government. It turned it to one that was about technocratic solutions to problems, separating politics from administration. Those of you who have taken an MPA course know that that's a big issue in our programs, talking about separating those two things. And the primary goal of local government was efficiency. In other words, the progressive era at the local level made the argument that local government should be run like a corporation, like a business. That had significant impacts on local government in the United States because many cities made the change from what were machine politics cities to progressively organized cities. And so, putting it in context, Detroit is now like most other cities in that it does district elections. So what does this matter? Why does this matter? It gets at the heart of representation in politics and in local government. Unfortunately, the debate on this is primarily theoretical, as the evidence of differences in cities with at-large and cities with city districts is pretty thin. And so I'm just going to briefly go over what are the justifications and the theoretical aspirations of each type of system. In an at-large system, which coming from the progressive era, the aspirations are you want to have council members who represent city interests, not parochial neighborhood interests, okay? City fathers is the old term they used to use, and thankfully they don't use that anymore, but it's the notion that you can take the city's interests at heart rather than your specific group that elected you. That most elections of city councils in at-large systems tend to be won based on name recognition and affiliation with peak associations like unions or parties in some sense, even though they're nonpartisan elections in most cases. In many cases, minorities are usually excluded. In the city of Detroit, it's kind of turned on its head because it comes down to what you mean by the term minority. But in the South in particular, these at-large systems were used to minimize African-American elections to city council. And then finally, what we see in these types of systems is low participation and efficacy, because the city council is this 9-member or 7-member, whatever city you're in, system of sort of distant elected representatives. Compare that with the district system. Compare that with the district system. The aspirations in the district system is that you get higher levels of responsiveness to constituent concerns and to neighborhood concerns, and also that minorities are included in city government.
So, to give you all a bit of a political science lesson for this morning, policy narratives are stories that advocacy groups and policy actors tell to sell a particular idea, sell a particular solution to a policy problem. And so just like your favorite book or favorite TV show or favorite movie, they have characters, they have heroes and victims and villains. They have a plot, a beginning, a middle, and an end, which basically say, this is what caused the policy problem that we're facing now. This is what caused this public issue that we're facing. The narrative arc is, here's how we get to solving the problem. And then finally, the moral of the narrative, or the moral of the story is, how do we solve the problem? So policy narratives are a political scientists' take on honing in the language and the stories that we tell about policy problems and issues in society, and how we go about addressing these problems, and how advocacy groups put forward certain ideas and depict people and how they act in the policy process. So when you leave today, you go to lunch and say, there are policy narratives. I can read them in the newspaper, which is exactly what we did. When the residential water shut-off started and a lot of the protest and public outcry about what happened, in my disaster mind, I thought, this is like a disaster, but it's not. But it's not actually a disaster. No one has flooded, there hasn't been a hurricane, there hasn't been an earthquake, but all of the same social consequences and political consequences of a disaster are present. So during the residential water shutoffs, we had the poorest of the poor in the city of Detroit, the most vulnerable people in our community, subjected to not having water pumped into their houses. We were in the midst of a financial crisis, which means that the city was in dire straits. We were in really, really difficult times, which look a lot like a natural disaster. The city of Detroit discovered that the DWSD didn't work correctly, and it hadn't worked properly as a government agency for some time. And the effect was that residents in the city of Detroit who basically robbed Peter to pay Paul. So they would put off paying a DTE bill or put off paying a water bill in order to pay their DTE bill, and back and forth. Or they'd pay their cell phone this month and put off paying the water bill for a while. And they were able to do this because the DWSD didn't function properly. So we had lots of major actors in the Detroit political scene come out in favor of keeping people's water on. And there were a few things that the water rights folks wanted. They wanted to make water affordable. They wanted to stop the shutoffs. They wanted moratoriums. And so those were the big solutions that they put out there. And then when we look at the frequency of who is responsible for solving the problem, it's the city and DWSD. So a lot of the research and the literature that was out there sort of suggested that we should find a lot of blame put on people that were poor and couldn't afford their bills, and we just didn't find that in our analysis of the narratives, which I was really surprised about. So what does this mean? It means a few things. It means that in the city of Detroit, as we talk about something as contentious and as like such a hot button issue as the water shutoffs, we are really reluctant in how we talk about how to solve problems to point out anyone as being a villain or a victim in it. So that should be really reassuring. The other takeaway, again, is this anthropomorphization of the city of Detroit. It is a character in the policy narratives that people tell about what goes on in the city. And so when we think about the future of the city, when people think about their adherence to the city, the idea that the city is a character that can benefit from certain policy solutions or be responsible for causing certain policy problems is something that is really part of our discourse, part of our policy discourse.
Unfortunately, especially when it comes to classic arts and culture organizations, symphonies, orchestras, museums, libraries, there is also a problem that stems from disconnectedness. Unlike some of the more dynamic cultural industries that are able to move and change their locations, should they end up in an area that suffers from all kinds of local problems, classic forms of arts and culture cannot move, and they're tied to their locations, meaning that they experience some of the same problems that other kinds of institutions that are located in the same areas and that were located in these areas hundreds of years ago suffer from. So because arts and culture organizations, the classical forms of arts and culture, don't have this ability to move, they suffer all kinds of problems, and they are forced to try to think about their audiences, diversifying their audiences, and connecting with those audiences in better ways. And the ability of arts and culture organizations to connect with their audiences becomes a key pillar of arts and culture sustainability. So what this project is trying to look at, the idea of the project is to try to actually assess whether arts and culture organizations in the Detroit metropolitan area have the capacity and the positioning to connect with the diverse audiences that they're trying to connect to build out their sustainability now and looking into the future. And what we basically do, we are trying to use this project to assess how accessible those institutions are to the traditionally underserved groups of population by exploring the socioeconomic factors of accessibility, as well as race and ethnicity, age, different age groups. And two notable cultural districts, expectedly so, one around the city of Detroit and the nearby suburbs, as well as one around the city of Ann Arbor and closer to the University of Michigan. And there is also a less notable but important cultural district around the area of Bloomfield Hills. What basically that tells us also, there are certain types of patterns that cultural institutions, locations have followed. One of those patterns is more likely being located in the center of population wealth. because those types of centers provide resources to arts and culture organizations. Being located in the center of population, so in larger areas there is more institutions in numbers. And finally, also being located in those areas that have a representation of local government institutions, such as a county seat. The question, though, becomes, just by looking at maps of those cultural institutions, we don't know much about the actual access and accessibility. So what we did in this project is the second stage of analysis. We constructed our own index of access to cultural institutions. So we used the community resource accessibility model that other scholars use when they research accessibility to health institutions or in food desert research, where people research access to grocery stores and supermarkets. There was no access zone with zero, meaning that there was at least some accessibility, even in remote parts of the Detroit metropolitan area, to arts and culture institutions. But we also found out that access is unevenly distributed. And in addition to mapping access using this new way of conceptualizing access, we also did the spatial analysis to try to figure out whether we can pin down the statistically significant areas of high and low concentration of arts and culture institutions, in other words, cultural deserts and cultural areas with high cultural presence.
And so when I'm asked to talk about Detroit, past, present, and future, I know that I enter a sliver of time in Detroit where I'm not qualified, but at the same time, I think I come with the same ethos that Detroiters have. And so when you start talking about what Detroit's past was, Detroit's past was beautiful, Detroit's past is black, Detroit's past is protective and very proud of its achievements. And I wouldn't say that it's not a comeback. Detroit has always been here. And so we were just trying to surface some of that stuff again. And so I'm honored to be here serving in Detroit. I'm honored to be here to walk alongside community groups that we spend a lot of time and commitment in. So we're going to share with you today a series of our projects. In case I get really nervous and you don't get and I flub up some stuff, I just want to give you sort of the punchline of what we're trying to do. Yes, planning department has the charge of dictating the future of the city in some capacity or another, right? Infrastructure, our capital projects, how is it going to build, how is it going to develop? 5 metrics that my new division is now tasked to come with. It's a healthy and beautiful Detroit, so you can talk about the quality of life. Healthy involves a lot of agencies. Beautiful Detroit talks about our capital projects, what we're going to put forth on the ground, how do we beautify the city from a physical standpoint, from the healthy standpoint, how do I improve one's quality of life? Inclusionary growth, how is the city growing? My team is tasked to look at how the city is evolving, what developments are happening, what sales are happening, how is the land being changed either through zonings, how is our master plan being changed? And the goal is to keep an eye on those things so we can actually measure if we are growing inclusively or not, right? And that's a really heavy word to unpack. Also, economic opportunity. As new corridors come about, what do those look like and how is that inclusive? Are these places actually being built for Detroiters? And then also, this is the key one I think most of you probably are interested in, is this atmosphere of trust, right? We're talking about division that you focus on peace and conflict. And so there's a lot of statements said about Detroit. There's been a lot of planning in Detroit. There's been a lot of projects in Detroit. But winning this atmosphere of trust, I think, is one of our largest hurdles. But we have a fleet of staff that's committed to that. My division has a very ambitious goal ahead of it, is can we actually keep a pulse on what's happening in this city to a degree that we feed insights into making higher level decisions? And alongside those desktop or qualitative surveys that we might deploy, desktop research or quality surveys in the field, continuing these meetings and engagement, how do we actually improve our menu of engagement so that we can actually hear more insights from the majority? Again, like I said, the population we capture at meetings are generally those who like to go to meetings. And so there's a far larger population that we hope to gain attraction with, that it's a level of ownership, right? When we talk about social justice, ownership in the city. This is for Detroiters. Yes, we want to attract new population to Detroit, but there have been thousands, hundreds of thousands that have stayed, that have seen a lot of injustices and deserve much. And so how do we focus on that, and how do I get them at the table to have these conversations with me? They're very blunt and they're very candid, and I can take it because the emotions are valid, the injustices are valid, and so how do we move forward together? So I'm not a fan of the us versus them because it's a we, but to get to we, I have to win an atmosphere of trust to have that conversation. So again, there's lots of ways to engage, and so that's just such a small snapshot of what we do, but we have 30 to 40 planning staff that are committed to protect what is rightly Detroit's, and to bring back the city as justly as possible. And that just means a lot of successes, and there's going to probably be a lot of hiccups and failures too. But to truly succeed, I do believe that we have to be vulnerable and acknowledge where we've tripped and where we've succeeded. And
I'm going to present a couple of alternative frames about how to think about development in the city, and hope that that might invite different ways to be thinking about the issues, and indeed, hopefully, that this would lead to some form of engagement where we can be thinking together about what might be more effective solutions for the people who live in the city. So a couple of just notions of different ways of thinking. One thing at the Key Center, we try to encourage what we call the 3 R's, right? And it's not reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's looking at any issues affecting the city through the lens of race, regionalism, and reconciliation. How well did they consider race, right? Did they put the issues affecting the city within a regional context? Are we looking aspirationally for reconciliation, not only with the boundaries of the city, but also looking for reconciliation across lines? Another mantra, because I'm going to talk a little bit about spatial racism. What is spatial racism? Linking the legacy of the last 50 years from the Kerner Commission, but also we go back 100 years or more. The notion of the racialization of space and the spatialization of race, right? And again, the racialization of space, the spatialization of race, right? At the center, we try to frame things through a lens of structural racism. And if you do that in Southeast Michigan, that leads to a notion of spatial racism. And then the thinking that we are advocating is saying we need at least 2 tracks, right? If we really are isolated and abandoned in the neighborhoods, and you saw all that money going, right? Where's that money going? Is not staying in the neighborhoods because there's not markets in the neighborhoods for that money. Then you actually have to start framing things much more along the lines of self-help, right? So one track, if there is abandonment, if these markets are not interconnected, is actually raising up issues of self-help, self-empowerment, self-determination as part of what we have to strive for. The second track has to be for more inclusive development, right? And that's going to be a longer, intermediate, longer-term process. And in theory, we can imagine those 2 tracks merging, right? There is no job market in these neighborhoods, and that gives you the unemployment rate. There are no supermarkets, right, in these neighborhoods, and that gives you the food deserts. There's no mortgage market. We have Quicken Loans, one of the largest mortgage lenders in the country, headquartered here, and yet we don't have a commercial mortgage market in the city of Detroit. There's no credit market. There's no housing market to speak of. There's no automobile insurance market. There's no transportation market, publicly or privately. And try to find a pediatrician or a physician or a dentist in the city, and you find out there's no medical markets, right? That is a profound challenge to us, and we can't simply solve that by projecting markets or assuming markets are there, which my tribe as an economist are like to do, right? That if I pour money downtown, the benefits of that money are actually not going to the neighborhoods. We'll never have a trickle down. We'll never have a spillover. We'll simply redound back to the benefit of the region, right? So what does this mean then? Right, back to this notion. I have one idea. I've told it 3 times. I'm going to tell you 2 more. Right, so when you walk out of today, this is the one thing you should remember, one of many things you should remember. If you're actually living in those neighborhoods, what does it mean for you to say, I'm investing, I'm developing, right? None of that's going to help you. And you're going to see another generation and another generation and another generation who are simply going to be bypassed and sacrificed and forgotten, right? In that setting, we have to actually lift up notions of self-help as an immediate strategy that needs to be implemented, supported by our city government, right? How do people help themselves? How do communities help themselves? And I've told this to groups of very establishment actors, and I look at them and I say, the Black Panther Party's 10-point plan has more to guide you in that question than anything the Chamber of Commerce will ever produce. right? And I think we have to be honest about that. We have it indigenously here. If we look at the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, a very rich notion of self-help, right? Self-empowerment, self-determination that's already there to be built upon and growing upon, but we need to have a self-conscious notion that self-help has to be the most immediate notion of development, right? The second track is still important, right? And we see seeds of that already within Detroit. The second track is actually say we want to integrate the neighborhoods into the city into the region, but we want to do that on inclusive terms. We don't want to reproduce the economic values that produce the kind of disinvestment and the kind of market failure that have created the problems back in 1968, the problems that exist here in 2018, right? And we have pioneering efforts in that, right? The community effort at community benefits ordinances is one step in that process. But the key factor then is that those two tracks can actually merge, right? If we're really getting into this notion of self-help, we're thinking of that in a very holistic notion. We're thinking about those individuals as citizens, both economically and politically. We're trying to raise the educational and the political awareness of these people. We're trying to consciously build power of the people who are disenfranchised. And that is the lever that can actually help us implement what would be an inclusive development strategy, right? We don't have the votes now, right? Just being very honest. We don't have the power to actually give the voiceless voice, but if we merge our vision of self-help in the neighborhood within this larger vision of inclusive development, then we actually might imagine, and imagining is a first step. The visioning process is incredibly important because if you can't imagine it, you can't do it.
For the planning department, your targeted neighborhoods, interesting and important to have viability as your watchword and then build on that. But our work in the schools leads us to some neighborhoods that are not very viable and are not targeted at peers. So I would invite your comment about the correlation between crime and non-viability neighborhoods and how they're to be addressed, because yes, we want to build up what's substantial and there already and keep it good, but restoring these areas, which are in some sense not populated and fully populated. How do you see that?
So it's always a really hard question why we're working in some areas and not others, and I don't actually have the full answer to that, but I just want to preface, and we can get you more detailed response, but just want to preface that planning efforts is only one of many city initiatives. So even though there's a lot of press given to the planning process and the categories that we're investigating in terms of how do we spur capital improvement projects, all the citywide initiatives, either through the police department or stakeholders in the neighborhood or beautification efforts happening at all levels of the agencies, are still in neighborhoods where we may not be doing concentrated planning, but there are still a lot of efforts happening on those lines.
Flooding has been a real issue in Detroit, and I'm wondering, is there a department that's working on infrastructure issues because of the inadequacy of our sewage system?
Right, so fix and maintain the existing infrastructure. In any of the streetscape improvements, we're looking at more improved drainage, infrastructure for that. All the plans also look at and almost mandate green water infrastructure, so if we're doing landscapes along that has to be part of it. If we're doing vacant land strategies, stormwater is part of that.
Just if we start thinking about things differently with different frames, we see things that we otherwise wouldn't. The broken infrastructure on water and other places, through the lens that I'm suggesting, is actually archaeological evidence of structural racism, right? So if we start understanding it and seeing it and connecting the dots, we have a different realization, and that would think about also the causes and solutions. The second thing that I would say, if we take this notion of an isolated neighborhood economy seriously, then we actually have what an economist would call a different capital labor ratio. So if labor is cheaper, right, as it is in the neighborhoods, then you use more labor and less capital.
I am from the 8 Mile Road in Wyoming area, Burwood, where the wall is. And right now, the community is trying to hold on to the Johnson Recreation Center and the Joe Louis Field. Are you familiar with that situation? Mm-hmm. How the Jesuits are trying to purchase the building? And many people in the community do not want that to happen because it'll be rezoned from institutional to, from recreational to institutional. And they know that the taxes in the community will go up. And there's other situations that the members of the community are very much concerned with.
Yeah. My just sort of quick answer is that a lot of people are invisible, right? And that's why I'm saying that notion of trying to really think about building self-determination as both an economic and as a political matter, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that power structures respond to.
A lot of people ask questions about money, obviously. So is there a lot of sponsorship that goes around with a lot of these urban development projects? And if so, what are the efforts being made in terms of these two-track solutions to help people with the self-help and give them empowerment? Where's the money that's able to allow them to do so come from? Because I think that's a big thing. A lot of what Detroit is money. That's a big issue.
You take the money out of the question, right? And you say, what do people have within their own control? And you start building from that outward. Right. So again, it's that notion. Once you switch the frame, you think differently, right? And you actually have a very different view of money, and money may actually be a threat, right, as opposed to something that aids you.
Sure. In these neighborhoods, there's a strategic neighborhood fund. I don't know the details, but we can get you details. But it's looking at a partnership of public dollars, private dollars, and philanthropic dollars. Again, when we're going through a neighborhood planning process, we have to have these real conversations too. So now that we've moved to implementation, let's just say I have a number of X dollars, but to fix my sidewalks and streets, it's going to cost me X dollars plus a lot more. So it's like, if I only have $10 to spend, then we have to make some hard choices with the community on where would you like to spend it. I've heard this, maybe I can't get to the field goal, but I can get us closer, right? And so these are conversations. Just because we have planning, the process, the engagement doesn't end. So once we start implementation, we have very real conversations about cost and development for each single project. So out of all the projects, you could have 5 to 7 implementation projects coming out of planning one. Each one will have its own engagement that talks about its funding and design decisions and cost decisions.
And the idea was, what we really need to do is get rid of these older buildings, and we need to essentially get rid of the slums, the blighted economic properties, and to continue to move forward. The present planning director for the city of Detroit is very design focused. Some are more policy focused. And this planning director was very design focused. And so what he said was they needed at that time to project this new city, this central portion of the city that would be completely rehabilitated from the old model, and that would be filled with new modernist buildings and improved streets and sidewalks and trees and parks and so on and so forth. So the purpose of this part of the talk is to help you realize that you are sitting here in this auditorium benefiting from this era. Okay. So this building and this whole portion of campus of Wayne State University was enabled by this particular mentality and by this particular program. Because if you've ever noticed that it looks kind of strange that 2nd Street stops right down the street, it just ends, and then there's sidewalks, that's because that used to be a street. That used to be a neighborhood. So throughout the city, throughout this central portion of the city, there were certain areas that were chosen to be bulldozed for this greater future, which would include medical buildings, which would include Wayne State University, which would include Lafayette Park, etc. But when you look back on this, I mean, what we have today, so when we talk about what are the surviving institutions, what is the revitalization of Detroit, what is touted in the papers, well, what's touted is, of course, Midtown, the greater downtown area. We have the DIA. It was saved because there was some concern, not just during bankruptcy, but also during the 40s and 50s. Could the DIA survive? You have Wayne State University, you have the Science Center, and so on and so forth. The past vision was a central portion of Detroit, which was essentially cleared out of certain undesirables and which was rebuilt in a modernist architectural conception and which essentially safeguarded its institutions. And that's what we have. This is the 7.2 square miles. This is the greater downtown area. And now, of course, everything that is being built now that is in this particular area, which is the so-called Midtown Revival, is indeed part of this conception that people had in the 50s. The vision, therefore, was incomplete. Okay. The vision was about physicality. The vision was about buildings. The vision was about what can we do to make it a prettier city, that we can remove the ugly portions. The vision was not about the economic health of people who could not work at the Detroit Medical Center. It was not about the neighbors that were being moved out. It was not about neighborhoods. It was an incomplete vision. So I thought I'd say these things first because I get worried sometimes when I hear people talking about what the vision of the future should be now. Because I think there is still this human tendency to be enamored of beautiful pictures. Because I know this history so well, I'm always very cautious, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what are we missing now the way they missed something then? What are we not thinking about now that they should have thought about then? And I think one of the ways to begin to think differently is to begin to rise out of this preoccupation with physicality and taking out blight and taking out ugly places, and to begin to think about what people really need in order to survive and in order to live.
This kind of bounces off the former question, but how can we specifically implement the 10-point program that the other speaker was talking about, the Black Panther Party 10-point program? Because they're not exactly far-fetched goals. So I'm just wondering if you have any like practical applications for those.
But I think it gets back again to this idea of self-help or self-determination. I think given the enormity of the beast that we're talking about, that at some point we have to figure out what's the appropriate scale for action. And the Black Panthers and effective community development people for generations now have picked the neighborhood.
So you started by saying, how does I pick out something? But the examples you're now giving are how I becomes we. And I has to become we with your neighbors, your friends, the people around you. One of the issues not discussed today, for example, is public transportation. And for example, the presentation we had, which talked about access, and if you had cars, it suddenly counted as access. Well, that's a different kind of access than bicycles and walking. But going back to your concerns, I'll use schools as an example. We're fighting very hard, some of us, and we've lost the battle in keeping schools and keeping people and children together. We've lost, I don't know if we've lost the battle, but we still have to fight the battle because children who don't meet each other that are different when they're children are the ones that don't have any understanding of the similarities between them when they're adults.
I think there are faith-based communities that are doing that better than anybody else. So there are faith-based groups that are essentially, of different kinds of faiths, Christian, Islamic, Baha'i. There are groups that are essentially taking on these community development tasks at the neighborhood level and essentially doing it maybe along with or outside of the typical organizational structures that exist. And I think that's probably the best way to go right now. And I know, I hesitate to say that. I wouldn't have said it if you didn't bring it up, because I don't want to give the impression that we can lay the burden of doing that on people. So the system fails, and so, sometimes we're told, okay, the system fails, and so why don't you educate your own children? Or, so I don't want to go there and give that impression. But I think that there are groups that are organizing to create alternative tutoring and educational opportunities, because if you trust your kids to the public school system and to the things that exist, organizationally, then they may not happen.
I'll use my own community as an example. I'm from Southwest Detroit, Spring Wells Village, to be exact, and there's a lot of money going in there, and there's a lot of programs for youth happening. And while developing and empowering the community is great, there's a high level of complacency when it comes to the injustices that are still facing people in that community. I'm talking specifically about ICE raids, deportations, and a lot of that. And I think that is incredibly connected to how we develop our city and how we build that trust that was mentioned earlier. And Detroit has historically said things like, oh, we're a welcoming city with no resolutions or actual changes. How can addressing those issues that leave people in insecurity and trauma be connected to city planning and how we're developing the city and looking towards the future?
That's a question that should be placed to the staff. And I think that their hearts are open to I mean, if you asked, I think they would listen. But I think you also, who are from Detroit or in Detroit, need to understand that this is a very design-oriented planning department. Other cities are not necessarily. Other cities are more focused on policy. So, so if you understand they're design-focused, then you need to figure out how to speak to them in a way that helps them understand that this is not a design problem, that this is something that's not going to be solved by streetscapes. You know, that we need some other kinds of action, and if you can't help me, then who else can help me?
We've had a talk, including Dr. Saperstein and Harriet and some others this week, about Canadians. From an urban planning perspective, I guess my question is twofold. Number one, what having an immigration department to openly recruit people of color, particularly Latinos, and then really quickly, the second thing I wanted to talk to is with these buildings and empty buildings, if they're doing things like they do in Western Europe or Canada to incentivize people to put in bids, not 2 or 3 or 4 bids from developers, but literally hundreds of bids, and then funding the one that has the most creative bid that involves long-term sustainable regenerative things for the community.
So it really does matter what the federal government is doing in terms of immigration. So it's not a lost cause, but I don't feel as optimistic as I did 5 years ago. I think that we have suppressed what could have been very salutary immigration, and I am very concerned about that. Here is a case where if the physical structures do decline, then people are not going to choose them first. If the jobs decline, people are not going to choose. What we can do is, of course, continue to value what immigration we can still have and to support what immigration we could still have. So to your second question, I think there, in terms of vacant buildings, what's happened in Detroit is, you know, people did not necessarily stay here and want to be here. And so if you've got like empty buildings in the middle of nowhere, including school buildings, it's very hard to keep them maintained.
We have to address the criminal justice system. There are presently 2 million men in the prisons, black and brown, and many of them are in there for petty drug cases. Cases that in Ann Arbor, they would get a ticket, $25 ticket, but down 94 this way, they would get prison, petty drug case. So we must really, all of us, think about what's happening today in our system today, what happened yesterday, before we even think about tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm one of the co-presidents of Period at Wayne State University. Hi, my name is Gabrielle. I am also co-president of Period at Wayne State University. Our 3 pillars are community, advocacy, and service, and we utilize those 3 pillars to serve demonstrators of Detroit. So work that we do surrounds providing demonstrators the name of the products that they need and breaking down stigma. So we are working with the Detroit Public Schools Community District. We're working with the Children's Center here in Detroit to educate young girls on menstrual hygiene practices and how to take care of their bodies. And then we're also working to provide care packages around the city of Detroit. And finally, we're working on campus policy and getting free products to all the students on Wednesdays and Fridays.
Detroit Community Assistance Program. Okay. And what we do is we try to help the homeless in the Detroit area by making care packages for them. And we make winter care packages, summer care packages, and we include stuff such as water bottles, food, non-perishables. We even get shampoos, conditioners, and other donations from like local Detroit funding projects.
One of the co-founders of Detroit Feedback League. This is a student-run nonprofit organization. We donate leftovers and excess food from our campus, different restaurants in the area, markets, to shelters all around the area.
The main mission kind of goal is to like reduce excess food waste in our community and hopefully eventually around the world. Because it's quite a growing problem, and there really is no reusable fix to it, at least we've seen so far. So we're excited to be a part of this group, and we're excited to do this work and kind of help the people in Detroit specifically, and hopefully all around the world eventually.
Address to like the president, essentially saying, I've lost control, this is what's going on, please help. And then it goes through the whole thing, how like the police, the crowd gathers, the police respond. Within 24 hours, they call the National Guard.
I'm Marta Zalewski. I'm the Director of Finance for Lean In. Our organization was founded by Facebook's COO, Sheryl Sandberg. And basically what we're trying to do on campus is make sure that women feel empowered enough to take a seat and at the table and lead it.
And our goals for this semester, since this is our first semester on campus, is to really bring together women all over campus and in the community and different organizations on campus and collaborate with them to feel more empowered and build more meaningful relationships within each other.
We are the college level version of the Rotary International Group. And so what that entails is we work locally with the Rotary Club, and we also work internationally with the international group on lots of service projects and community development and professional development on an individual level.
So Circle K International at Wayne State University is the largest student-run service organization on campus. Last year we had 57 members, and our members completed thousands of service hours in and around Metro Detroit. We work with a lot of long-term partners, so we work with them throughout all the semesters. So those include the Children's Center of Midtown Detroit, Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries, Arts and Scraps, Keep Growing Detroit, and several hospitals in the area.
So we are part of a larger organization called Kiwanis, and so Kiwanis is the international version, and so then Circle K is the collegiate version. We are actually the world's largest collegiate service organization. So what we do is we have 3 pillars: service, which Sarosh talked about, and then leadership and fellowship. So our fellowship is, we actually have 13 chapters within Michigan itself. So we meet them for monthly meetings, and we also have district events where we do service outside of just Detroit. So we're not impacting just our city, which is the most important to us, but we're also impacting other cities and just the state in general. And we also do a lot of fundraising on the international level. Last year we raised, I think it was $2,000 for the WASH project, which is water and sanitation and hygiene. So for third world countries, we're trying to get them clean water and septic tanks. And then we also raised about $200 for the Flint water crisis, because first and foremost, as Wayne State, we love to give back to Detroit and its surrounding areas.